Hi, my name is Michael Lutz, and during this summer, my team and I studied YouTube's reflection of user political bias. Essentially, if you use YouTube, we want to study how YouTube gets content towards you and how it reflects potential bias. So to really grasp what our project entails, let's go through a few definitions and assumptions. Principally, we define political bias as a singular bias towards a particular political ideology. Whilst there are many political ideologies, we assumed that most um, value judgments would fall into a left or right leaning category. Even though there are more, we assume that it would fit into one or the other, and this just helps with the simplicity and actual validity of our project. Next, it's important to understand how we define YouTube users. This is actually a slightly iffy subject because there are two valid answers. First, you could consider YouTube's users to include content creators, or you can consider it to just include content viewers. And finally, the reflection of bias is actually a term that we're kind of coining for the sake of brevity, but essentially reflection is how YouTube presents videos to content users based on the bias of the user. But essentially, because user has two definitions, this can either mean the average bias videos have on YouTube or singular bias that a single user might have. And in both cases, YouTube's reflection of bias might mean that it magnifies user bias by providing more biased videos, minimizes them, or preserves the user bias. And so given this, the best way that we thought we would be able to measure how YouTube reflects bias is first, we would be able to look at YouTube's search algorithm to see what the average video bias is for a particular search term. And then we could see if YouTube maximizes, minimizes, or preserves that bias within the videos that get ranked within the top 3 of each search. The second way was examining YouTube's post-video recommendation algorithm that recommend a video to watch next after each video. So we wanted to see for new users whether YouTube will recommend more biased, less biased, or similarly biased videos. A common theory is that YouTube creates an echo chamber, where in this case, a user would be recommended more biased videos or similarly biased videos after watching a particular video. And so we wanted to test this. Okay, so before we actually get into the different experiments that we just discussed, we have to be able to actually categorize the bias. So to actually be able to quantify the bias, we relied on a BERT natural language processing algorithm provided to us from the Bipartisan Press, who were able to classify bias on articles with a 77% accuracy and were able to regress with a 6.3 mean average error. For the sake of this project, we will be feeding in video transcripts to the Bipartisan Press algorithm, and we'll be using the regressed numerical output for our analysis where positive values, as you can see on the number line, are right-leaning and negative values are left-leaning. And the magnitude of the bias actually determines the extremity, or the magnitude of the score determines the extremity of the bias. And so for the sake of brevity, if you would like to learn more, here's a link to the Bipartisan Press's training methodology, and you can just type it in on Google, and hopefully that should give more information. So for the first experiment, we wanted to analyze YouTube's search algorithm and how it reflects the political bias of the totality of videos within a certain search term. To contextualize, if you go to YouTube and search presidential debates, there will be hundreds of videos on the subject, but likely you will only see the top few. So we wanted to see if the average bias for the hundreds compares to the average bias of the few. And that's how we'll determine how YouTube reflects bias. So to gather our data for this experiment, we went under similar conditions to normal users that they would normally use if they were to use YouTube. So we actually created 4 distinct accounts by scraping random videos and based on the Bipartisan Press bias metrics, we chose 20 videos for each account to fully watch. To clarify, the center account watched 10 left and 10 right-leaning videos, and the null account didn't watch any videos. However, one important thing to notice is that after we actually did the analysis, we later discovered that the average bias for different accounts were not significantly different. So we just combined the video sets because there was no significant difference between the bias. They're roughly the same, regardless of what original account you had previously. We then utilized 30 search terms using isidewith.com polls to create a list of 15 left supporting terms and 15 right supporting terms. For instance, Biden would primarily be a left supporting term, and Trump would primarily be a right supporting term. We then looked for the top 200 results from a page And we stopped at 200 due to processing limits and time constraints. But this still created a data set of 24,000 videos. And because some videos didn't have provided transcripts, we had to discard them. And our final data set had 18,091 videos with transcripts. So to understand how we actually did the analysis, it's first important to discuss the hypothesis. So our null hypothesis was that videos within the top 3 will have the same bias as from the entirety of the data set. The reason we chose the top 3 is that a backlinko study of 5 million Google's results found that the biggest click drop-off rate was after 3 results, which made 75% of clicks. So our assumption was that this would carry over to YouTube, which is another similar search algorithm. So importantly, here is actually the crux of our results, kind of. So this is actually the distribution of bipartisan press values throughout the entire data set. This seems to follow a trimodal logistic Cauchy distribution. And as you can see, there are roughly similar amounts of bias from left and right-leaning videos on both sides of the spectrum. Interestingly, there were actually more extreme bias videos than there were moderately biased videos, as you can see over here. But videos on YouTube, most of them seem to have very little bias. In fact, even including all the extreme bias videos, because they cancel out, the average bias for the entire data set is roughly negative 0.04. And so what this really means is that the bias for like the users in this data set seems to be no bias. And so when we look at the top 3 bias compared to the entire data set, we have some interesting results. In fact, within the top 3 results, there seems to exist a slight left-leaning bias, with the average bias value in the top 3 results being negative 1.69. This graph also displays 95% confidence intervals using our prior hypothesis. And these results are significant with a p-value of less than 0.001. So this seems to suggest that YouTube magnifies bias towards left-leaning results within the top 3. And so moving on to our second experiment, we wanted to see how YouTube's recommendation system reflects bias of starting videos. For instance, if you're a user on YouTube, if you were to click a random video, would you get more biased videos or less biased videos or similarly biased videos if you were to continue to click the recommended videos? So to gather our data, we use slightly similar processes, except we actually used the previous data set to create 6 categories of videos, each containing 200 randomly chosen videos, and each category was 7.5 bipartisan press values apart. We essentially got the 12,000 videos, because 6 times 200 is, or 1,200 videos. These are the seed videos, and each seed video we scraped we essentially scraped from each seed video and went 10 videos after that. So we would click the first recommended video 10 times, and we call each of these times we clicked it cycles. And we got the transcripts from each cycle. And given how some videos didn't have transcripts, we ended up getting a video list of 10,379 total videos. So our hypothesis for this was essentially, because we wanted to test for the facilitation of echo chambers, our alternate hypothesis was that the bias of seed videos would be less than the bias of videos at the 10th cycle. And so here's pretty much the main result: bias over cycles per left and right leans. And so this is actually a very novel and interesting result. The graph represents the average bias of videos per cycle, and the red bars represent right-leaning videos with positive values, and the blue bars represent left-leaning videos with negative values. And so even though both started at around roughly negative or positive 11 in bias units, the bias actually decreased over each cycle. Ultimately, the difference at the 10th cycle and the first cycle using our hypothesis tests was statistically significant with a p-value of less than 0.001. And so we wanted to take this actually a step further and look at what happens when you look at the individual bias categories. And so that's what we did with this. And if you look over here, we see the same trend continues to reciprocate itself with everything being statistically significant with at least a p-value of less than 0.05. Now, what this means is that if you go to a YouTube video and if you create a YouTube account and go to a YouTube video, regardless of the bias of the original video, if you watch maybe a few videos, you will actually start to get less biased videos. And by the 10th video, it will be there will be a statistically significant difference. If you watch a bunch of videos, if you watch one video, it's going to be less biased. And so this is actually a very interesting result, as many articles and even news sources have suggested that YouTube's recommendations facilitate the creation of echo chambers. However, what this means is that if a user develops an echo chamber, it's most likely because their activity suggests that they actively search for biased content versus them just going on YouTube and clicking recommendations. And so there are a few limitations to our study, principally the fact that some videos have missing transcripts, even though there is no significant pattern between the missing videos, might skew our results a little bit. To actively combat this issue, we are currently using auditory processing to create transcripts for those videos that were missing. Secondly, the bipartisan press metric, while still very accurate, still has its own potential for error. In a future study, we'd want to use a multitude of natural language processing algorithms to get a more accurate bias calculation. And third, despite more left-leaning videos ranking within the top 3 within our first experiment, that doesn't necessarily mean that YouTube blindly favors left-leaning videos. This could be due to a numerous range of other factors, including relevance, watch time, and click-through rates that inherently favor left-leaning videos. But we don't know if this is the case. We would have to test it in a future study. Our hope, however, is that this study garners the interest from other researchers to further this project and fully understand how YouTube and other social media reflects bias and the potential impacts of doing so. So in conclusion, in the search algorithm, YouTube seems to actually maximize left-leaning bias within the top 3 search results. However, within the recommendation system, YouTube seems to minimize bias regardless of the original result. And really quickly, before this recording ends, we would like to first thank Dr. Mui, ASDRP, our parents, and the All of Children Foundation for supporting us throughout this research journey.